To write eternity on a piece of paper is so easy. Then everything else follows. Poets, drunkards, lovers, flowers.
I think of Steve as really like a marker of a particular time and a particular kind of attitude that is really rare to find now.
To find eternity is very hard. To be eternity is very hard.
Driving upstate, stuck in traffic, desperate need to hear a voice that would change our perception of time.
If we enjoy ourselves, then our story will be easier to take, swallow, history, tragedy,
I caught myself thinking,
logo,
what kind of
theosophy,
piece would I
democracy,
write about this?
immediacy. Get drunk and anything sounds good.
The music was bad and
cry
I
yourself
lost
to
one of my
sleep.
favorite
Don't
hats.
think about the ultimate, highest jazz
If
poem.
anyone wants to get me one, please feel free to do so.
He was never thrifty with his emotional engagement in the arts and with artists and writers
can
and
always
musicians.
count on
And that
Uncle
seems
Steve,
to
he
me
said.
difficult to find now in people.
I don't even like being called a poet.
Being a poet's very
I
important,
was
and
probably never
and there's too
successful
many
in
of us
poetry,
doing these
but the
things,
poetry
although it's
kept
better than if we
continuing
were
and continuing.
murderers or rapists.
Easy
That's
to
the
write
real
death and
point.
then
I mean,
eternity
that's
follows.
the real
As
damn
easy
thing.
Steve
to run
really
away
symbolized
or walk
for
to the
a
end
lot
of
of
the
us,
street
a lot of
and
us younger
just
people
keep
in New York,
walking.
a way of living as a poet that was very inspiring and kind of unusual at the time.
Maybe if we reach the river, we can take the stone and drop it in. She swims slowly around the
The
island.
poem that transports
Swims
me
in
immediately
circles
into another
slowly.
world.
She
Without
swims
unnecessary
slowly in
rhyme,
circles around
with
the
direct
island.
and urgent
Slowly,
musicality.
circling with quiet
Silences at
strokes.
the right places.
Syrup around the
And
island,
repetitions.
strapped to herself.
Repetitions.
This is like paradise, she
Thought
says
flows like a
later,
saxophone melody.
walking back to the car. This is like paradise.
Steve held the keys to the
She
gate
swims
all alone.
slowly around the island. When I asked the man for directions on how to get to eternity, he said just keep walking.
I had a
And
very
then you'll
pure
come to the end
approach
of the
to
street.
writing that was not
And when you get
interested
to the end of
in
the street,
trends
just
or
keep
being well
walking,
known
and you'll come to the
necessarily.
end of the street. And when you
Does
get to
not
the end of
like
the
to be
street,
branded
just
as a
keep
jazz
walking,
poet.
and you'll get to
Or
the end of the
branded in
street.
any way.
And when you get to the end of the street, just
Unacademic.
keep walking. You
well
get the
read
idea.
and deeply knowledgeable, but completely self-taught.
This is hip.
If New
This is a
York
jazz
was a
poem.
language,
Run it through
he
your
mastered
fingers and
it.
play it.
and
Say
it fountained through
This
him.
document of heat. This is a jazz poem. Covered in circumstance, circumference of roundabout head trip, cooler than tonight, into nebula hotness. It's it, this thing called free. So enjoy yourself.
There was hardly a show which Steve didn't storm in for at least a minute,
On Friday,
just to
May
head to
10th
another
this
one
year,
to make sure he was there when it
7:30
happened.
set
Like 3 or 4
at
concerts a
Campello
day
Jazz
sometimes,
Gallery.
or a reading,
Then
and then he had
for
to
an
run off and go to
8:30
a
set
concert
with
and
Matt Shipp and
something
Derek
else. So
Jones
it-
at
I
the
live in a
Stone.
world
Matt Shipp
that
is
is
playing
dead.
at the Stone.
Then
How
came
can I
back
miss
for
Surrounded
the
by
that?
the
second
living,
set with Evan Parker at
screaming
You
Jazz
can
Gallery.
see from
acrobats.
Governor's
and
Island.
survive
then
It's
to
part
see
of the
an
New York
art show
Poetry
in
Festival.
between and to talk to people
We
in
read it
between.
till
I
the
mean,
fall.
It's
Part
it-
of Paris Lit
when I
Up.
think about
Then
it, it's like
you go
almost
to
exhausting to
Garden.
think about a
After,
day in the
we go
life
to
of
the
Steve
Surgal.
Dalachinsky.
Like a fish
Take part in a
behind
marathon
glass.
reading.
Soaked
of
in
St.
enough
Paris,
of the music
15,000
to attempt the
23-line epic
impossible.
poem.
He had taken in an ecstatic free jazz concert by the Sun-Ra Orchestra.
Don't look for tragedy. It's right here where you left it, in the amphitheater, surrounded by a chorus of music and words and misunderstanding.
The dead confronting the
Zanzi,
dead, the
when
dead,
one person
the
is
spirits,
right and one
the
is
dead
wrong,
are not
that's
really
melodrama.
dead. The
When
air
two
is
people are
full
right,
with their
that's
breathing.
tragedy.
Their sighs,
When we
their joys, their
Democrats decide
sorrows,
just to
their
enjoy
air,
ourselves
air,
in
air, the
weight
dead,
and in
the
flood,
dead, they are not
our story
really dead.
will be easier to handle.
You go where you must. You always go where you must. In the end, you go where you must. You go. You go. You go where you must.
You're listening to Extended Techniques, a podcast about contemporary music through the lenses of timbral innovations.
Not too long ago, a very observant culture critic wrote in foreword, "If you find yourself at an avant-garde jazz concert and poet Steve Dalachinsky is not in the audience, you probably have the wrong address."
Knowing that we will now always have the wrong address at any show, we want to remember some moments when Steve, the collages of words and sounds, was on stage.
Fruit flies seem to be coming out of my body, out of my very skin. Ripening banana, squeezed orange. Damned fruit flies, leaving my chest through my nipples, into every room I enter, around the kitchen sink. I give them purpose, create a purpose, they acquire purpose. Alphabet without knowledge of itself, numbers without sequence, mind too scattered to give meaning to. 7th and K, where I grew up, lava to adult, among Jews, among Italians, among Jews, among letters, numbers.
Perhaps Fruit Flies was one of Steve's favorite poems. He infuses new meaning in it with every reading. When Steve read it at the Stone in February last year...
There was the Stone at Avenue C, one of the final nights before it closed, wasn't it?
Right, it was Lower East Side Elegy 3, Frank London's Shekhinah Big Band. The entire performance, with already quite ecstatic music, acquired some kind of hope and purifying light. But going back to the 90s, here is what New York Times wrote about Steve's performance at the Passover Seder at the Knitting Factory in 1997. Steve Dalachinsky, another writer, recited a work about the 10 plagues, particularly fruit flies, which mixed Yiddish and yoga.
My favorite Y words. I guess they refer to kishkes and chakras. The next time I remember seeing Steve was the staging of Russian absurd display Lapa on a snowy February evening of 2001 in East Village. I thought I knew Daniel Harms's works pretty well, but Lapa was new to me, a brilliant avant-garde dream play that Matvei Yankelevich staged for one night only. It is there that I noticed how distinct and theatrical was Steve's voice.
Let's hear how the director remembers this production.
In fact, the snow was it was an interesting moment because it started snowing that late that evening or late afternoon, and the drummer was stuck in traffic. So he brought in his drums about 20 minutes into the performance and set up, and it looked like it was part of the play, just setting up the drums and starting to play with the group while everything was already happening, which was kind of beautiful. I didn't know Steve's work as a poet before that event and only came to know it more afterwards. And but I liked the tone of his voice, and I was looking for different voices that had different textures. So Steve's voice as an older voice and kind of gravelly and a different kind of Brooklyn accent and all of that made it just varied the voices and helped kind of create different tonalities.
11 years later, in 2012, having seen Steve at countless jazz performances and his own readings, I asked him to read selections of Brazilian surrealist poet João Cabral de Melo Neto at the event I ran at Brazilian Endowment for the Arts. Steve was intrigued, as he never heard about this poet before, and I reminded him of Lapa experience that he liked, so he agreed to participate. He didn't rehearse. "I want to be surprised," Steve said. So he was reading the poems for the first time at the event, and it sounded just perfect.
And he said that he enjoyed the reading and was pleasantly surprised to discover a new poet.
It seemed natural to invite Steve back to Brazilian Endowment for the Arts next year, in 2013, to read texts by another Brazilian modernist, Clarice Lispector, and his own poetry as well.
Steve added his personal tinge to the text, almost as if transforming Lispector's prose to poetry. He repeated some words and lines and made sounds like he often did with his own poems. It almost felt like Clarissa's text became Steve's own text, as if the boundary of authorship disappeared.
One day the comfort in God, and no matter how paltry it is, we must learn that this is from the beginning in the warm shelter of our birth. To be useful and useless is freedom. To have meaning would belittle us. We are gratuitously just for the pleasure of being, and from the future we will consciously wait for the lack of meaning, of freedom in speaking, in feeling this happiness is nothing more than feeling an with relief and Then let us raise our glasses and modestly toast an to this God. Though it's hard for me to finish, it hurts so much to say goodbye. Doesn't it? Doesn't it hurt to say goodbye? Well, maybe because in me it hurts. The hurts. So why God? Why God? Why not just sit smoking and dying of hunger? It's because you want to be able to say, Do we exist simply to be relieved? I pay attention only to pay attention, only to pay attention. Pay attention, deep, 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 deep down. I don't want to know. I don't want to know anything.
We came back to Brazilian and Portuguese surrealist poetry in 2017 at Burl's Poetry Shop in Brooklyn, at the event called Reflections on Trance Experience. Steve read poems by Fernando Pessoa, Paul Leminski, and Nelson Asher. The last two he also encountered for the first time and instantly liked.
When he was reading Leminski's short poems, he would repeat them several times, as if a refrain in a song, and Aaron Novik's music was very apt.
Let me vanish, let me melt, let me fall apart until after me, after us, after all, nothing but charm is left. Let me vanish, let me melt, let me fall apart until after me, after us, after all, nothing but charm is left. Nothing the sun could not explain. Everything the moon makes glamorous. No rain fades this flower. Nothing the sun could not explain. Everything the moon makes glamorous. No rain fades this flower. Let me vanish, let me melt, let me fall apart.
Later that year, I introduced Steve to my friend, a leading experimental guitarist from Rio de Janeiro, Marcus Campello. They instantly became friends and played a few gigs together, including our event on the themes of spirit possessions in Spectrum.
The event was called Quintavant in New York. It was in February 2018 to celebrate Steve's and Marcus' LP release.
She covers, she covers, she covers her face. She turns her head. She turns. The noises of silence, the loudness of silence, the birds of silence, the silence of silence.
Marcus plans to issue another record they've made together. Let's hear a short piece they recorded at Steve's apartment.
In the grain of our ancestors, in the tranquility of flatness, a warmth, a chill across the great green table and the backs of our necks, a chill in winter mist, in front of the funeral parlor, an old man's face falling apart. In the grain of our ancestors, in the tranquility of flatness, a warmth, a chill, across the great green table, and the backs of our necks, in winter mist, in front of the funeral parlor, an old man's face falling apart.
Steve recalled with warmth his collaboration with Marcus many times, and Marcus, like many musicians, poets, and artists in New York's Lower East Side, was inspired by Steve's pure artistic pursuit and disregard of any obstacles that could disturb his creative process.
People would notice if you stop doing it, but when you're doing, they don't really know about it. It's like a monk praying for people that nobody cares about it, but when he stops praying, then people will notice.
We'll let Matvei Yankelevich from Ugly Duckling Press, that published several of Steve's books, talk about his poetic legacy.
He came out of a sort of avant-garde music and small press poetry kind of scene that never distinguished between the aesthetics and the politics, that was always very conscious of the political nature of a kind of aesthetic antagonism to the mainstream or to overly art with a capital A and like establishment kind of institutionalized art frameworks. He was always interested in the spaces that were a little bit more underground and in the kind of networks that fostered. And so I think his poetry, brings out a lot of that network, a lot of that kind of the way he mentions other people in his poems, the way he mentions musicians, the way that is an intimate way, not like a name dropping, but like an intimate knowledge of all of these networks and all of this listening that he had done. And so I think it's actually important, this attitude in his poetry of revealing or uncovering injustices that have to do with and just the world of that he was living in, especially I think in Soho, seeing the changes that were happening in Soho and feeling the kind of general injustice of how arts were being driven out of New York, the sort of marginalization of people like himself. And he really felt that as a kind of, I think, he really felt that as a kind of basic problem of modernity or the contemporary moment, a kind of disregard for pure artistic pursuits. And he would rail against them in his poems. Things that I particularly recall from his readings and reading him on the page really invested in a certain idea of beauty, of awe in front of the artistic creation. And I think that's it's kind of it sounds maybe banal or old-fashioned, and maybe that was a kind of old-fashioned aspect of Steve, but he really wanted his poems to be not separate from other works of art, but kind of in reference to and among, and like a kind of like a place. The poems became a place where he could describe that awe and that belief in the arts and the kind of deep, for him, really deep felt sense of inspiration from others and from other artworks, from music, from concerts, records, paintings, poems, everything. So like I think the poetry has this really beautiful way of juxtaposing those injustices of the world with what was for Steve ethically good, which was this sort of unfettered creativity.
Pray for me, for I have been ambushed. Pray for me the way he played for the head bobbing kid in the first row. Pray for me because the older I get, the less tomorrows there are. Pray for me, for I am what there was before the world came into existence.
Pray as if the prayer you are praying was the quirkiest blues ever intoned. Pray for me in jagged voice and broken tongue, in soft lament, complaining moan, and joyful agonizing shriek. Pray for me, jagged stone that I am, until I am withered and gone, and even after that, pray for me. Pray for the zigzag lines of my life, for as long as they remain a pattern on your less than shiny skull. And when they're gone, pray for me anyway. Pray for me as if my life depended on it, as if your life depended on it. The mirror is a shore surging and receding. Your voice can be a part of the breaking. Pray for me. Lift me out of the bedrock with my wedlock with the dark. Pray for me, embattled jackal that I am, fruitless searcher rooted in a swamp of self-denial and complete disquiet. Pray for me as I am forced to strip and made to walk down the naked highway. Pray for me on those cold nights and summers too. Pray for me the way ecstatic peace seekers raise their voices in jubilation, the way a group of not so holy lovers of death have prayed together for centuries. Pray for me as I vanish from the planes of geometry, preparing to regroup and rehearse. Pray for me when I am struggling like a peach in Satori. Pray for me as I ingest a drug whose side effects are suicidal thoughts, suicidal attempts, and suicide. Pray for me, my private affairs of the heart, impaled and imploding within the body of a thief. Pray for the ruthless way I thrust the homeless from my door. Pray for me, for it was my prayers that killed my brother, and God exists only to judge us. Pray for this inhibited near-rabid stereotype, the engine that starts the fire. Pray for me. I like to take, I don't like to give. Pray for me for that reason alone, if for no other. I realize the insignificance of your prayer, but pray for me anyway. Pray for me, please, pray for me, pray for me, for little I do is ever understood. Pray for me, for I am a creature of this island and I shall never get off. Pray that my foul thoughts might someday be made amicable, that my foul mouth washed clean. Pray that I may never become a consultant. Pray for me. Pray as my place of dwelling becomes more domesticated. Speak blood, bone, and soul, the poverty of words. Pray for your once and only uncolonized son. Pray as if your prayers may be overheard, take shape, rise like a spirit on an upward path. Pray that the lights will never be extinguished. Pray for the false threat that I am, for the toothache to go away, for the smile to return to our faces, for the clear bottom boats that allow us to see, for my generosity toward those on death row. Pray for me. Pray for me, for I have abused substance. Pray for my partner. Pray for the sutures in my heart, for the narrows to widen, for the fuzziness of ownership and the cheap sentimentality that my departure will cause. Pray for the genuineness. Pray for me. Pray.